Okay, hi class. So this video here is going to basically do a review of utility questions, and it's going to be referring to the Bukit Merah Secondary School paper that you guys have already done. Okay, so you should also look at your responses, look at the sources involved, and look at the case study from this particular source-based case study that you have already been exposed to. Okay, so I'm going to start off by reviewing what utility questions are. So basically, these are the usefulness questions. Okay, so let's just quickly run through the criteria again. What determines if a source is useful or not? Okay, so the first criteria we can use is the idea of relevance. Okay, so basically, if a source tells us something about the issue, it is relevant. Okay, and if it's relevant, it is useful. Okay, so this is when we make an inference, and basically based on the inference, if it's related to the topic that we want to find out about, it is going to be useful. Okay, so this is on the content level, the most basic level. Then another way to determine if a source is useful or not is to look at its accuracy or reliability. Okay, and so basically, how do we determine if a source is reliable or not, right? So this requires us to either cross-refer to our contextual knowledge or to other sources. So this is how we determine whether a source is reliable or not. Okay, whether what it says is accurate. Okay, and another way to determine whether a source is reliable or not is to perhaps look at the provenance. Okay, who is saying this, for example? Who is the author of this particular source? So by looking at the provenance, we can determine whether there is any reason to question the reliability of the source itself. And finally, another criteria we can look at is insight. Does this source provide us insights into a particular issue? Okay, so for example, if it gives us a balanced view of a particular topic, it does provide insights, right? And if it does, it is then reliable and hence useful. Okay, so does it provide any insights about a particular topic? Okay, so before we move into the question and the source-based case study, I want you to look at the part on the right, the points to note. So these are basically points that I have surfaced based on the work that you've submitted and that I have marked. Okay, so I want you to make sure you remember this. The first thing is when you assess usefulness, make sure you refer to reliability. Okay, so the idea of accuracy. So for example, when you cross-refer, why are you cross-referring? You're cross-referring to determine whether a source is reliable, and therefore being reliable or not, that will then determine its usefulness. Okay, so whenever you cross-refer, make sure you make mention about reliability. Okay, and another thing is also when we look at viewpoint or purpose, this also helps us to determine, right, whether a source is reliable or not, and therefore whether it is useful or not. So again, make sure you link reliability to usefulness. And the way you phrase is also important, because if you don't phrase it correctly, you will not be given the mark. Okay, so the correct phrasing will look something like this. Okay, if you are cross-referring, source A is useful because it is reliable. Okay, it's useful because it is reliable, as it is supported by, for example, another source or supported by my contextual knowledge. So this is how you should phrase your assertion when you cross refer. Okay, if you phrase it like this, source A is useful as it is supported by, but with no reference to reliability. So you skip the whole part about because it is reliable. Basically, this will cause you to drop a level. Okay, because you have omitted the idea of reliability. And you should also not have something like this. Source A is useful and reliable because something. It is not useful and reliable. It is useful because it is reliable. Okay, so if you say useful and reliable, basically the link is not there, so you're not drawing the link because between usefulness and reliability, you will also not be given the correct assertion. Okay, so be very careful when you phrase your assertions. Okay, the next point I want to raise is the idea of cross-referencing. So most of you actually tried cross-referencing. Be aware of what the main source is. Okay, so if the question asks you how useful is source A, so your main source is of course source A, right? Okay, so you should phrase it like this: source A is not useful because it is not reliable as it is challenged by source B. So basically, the other source that you are cross referring to is the one challenging this main source or supporting this main source. Okay, so you cannot say as it challenges another source, but rather it is being challenged by this external source that you're bringing into the picture. Okay, so be very careful when you phrase your assertions. Okay, so let's dive into the actual source-based question. So when you read all the sources in this case study, you've seen this issue, right? How has the Russian-Ukrainian war impacted the global economy? So this is basically the source-based question issue. So the first thing you should ask yourself is, what are the keywords here? So it's clearly the Russo-Ukrainian war and also its impact on the global economy. Okay, so what kind of repercussions has it had on the global economy? So what does this global economy refer to? So you should think about what this might mean. So it might look at things like the impact on uh, other countries, right? Beyond Russia and Ukraine itself. Okay, we're talking about the impact on regions or on the world economy itself. Okay, so these ideas are related to idea about the global economy. So it's not just about Russia and Ukraine, but it's also about how the war between these two countries have impacted others. Okay, so make sure that you read the question, highlight the keywords, and think about what the keywords seem to imply. What do we need to focus on? Okay, so the first question we're going to look at now is the usefulness question. So it says study source D. How useful is this source as evidence of the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on European countries? Again, make sure you identify the keywords in this question. So what are the keywords? We're looking at the impact of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And not just that, they specifically want you to find out what impact on European countries. Okay? On European countries. So pay very careful attention to the question and the keywords in the question. Okay, so this is the source itself. Okay, so first when you look at the source itself, think about what does the source tell me about the impact of this war on European countries? What are the most important details from the source? Okay, so let's have a look. You realize that you can pause the video if you want to reread the source, but if okay, so I'm going to just carry on. So what are the details? So firstly, one thing we realized that European countries had to increase government spending, okay, on refugee aid, and this will place a strain on the governments in the short term. Okay, so this is one impact that the war has had on European countries. Okay, so they increase government spending to take care of the welfare, right, of these refugees that come flooding into the country. Anything else? Oh, but you realize that the second part talks about some positive economic effects as well, right? So for example, oh, the migrants or the refugees have increased trade and sales of products in the European countries, which means, hey, when they go over to your country, they're actually buying your goods, right? So, hey, this is good, right, for the local economy. They are buying local products, okay? And furthermore, oh, some of them might stay in these countries for good. And what's so good about that is they will boost the labor force so they can participate, right, in the workforce. And when they are working, they can contribute positively, right, to the country's economies in the long run. Okay, so basically these parts that I've underlined are details that essentially relate to the idea of the impact on European economies. Okay, so I'm asking you now, in terms of relevance, is this source useful as evidence on the impact of the war on European countries? Yes, because it does tell us about the impact, so it's relevant. Therefore, at least on the content level, it is already useful. Okay, so this is your most basic idea. But next, we want to move on to cross-referring, to determining its reliability. Okay, so which source can we actually cross-refer to? So study the sources very carefully. You might want to pause the video here. Choose which is the most appropriate source that basically deals with the same issue, okay, that we can cross-refer to. If you choose the wrong source, sometimes you basically lose this particular level. Okay, so after reading all the other sources, you realize that the source that perhaps is most appropriate is actually source B. Why? Because source B also relates to the idea of the impact of the war on European countries. So what does it say about European countries? Okay, so if you read carefully, you realize that more than 45 nations saw how important it is to make Ukrainian food products available on the market. Oh, because it clearly says here, right, from European countries to Indonesia and China. Okay, and it also says, oh, rising prices. This global food shortage has actually caused rising prices in every country. So this also includes European countries. So you realize that actually this is quite an appropriate source to cross-refer to. So does it actually challenge or support? It depends on which part you want to focus on for the first source, right? Whether you want to focus on the positives or the negatives. So the part highlighted in blue or the part highlighted in green. So green is the positive, blue is the not so positive part. Okay, so let's say I want to focus on the green part. Okay, I want to focus on the green part. So if you realize that if you want to focus on the green part, you realize that source D is not useful because it actually not reliable because it's challenged by B. Okay, because I'm using the blue part versus the green part, right? So clearly source B challenges the main source, which is source D. Then I make my inference. So what I can do here is to put my inferences of source D and source B together and make sure that when you make this inference, there's a clear match. So my inference is, I can infer from source D that European countries benefited from the war, but I can infer from source B that European countries did not benefit from the war. Okay, so essentially, go on to quote the relevant details. So in this case, I will quote the parts in green for source D and then provide a short explanation. So this suggests that the war brought refugees whose consumption of local products and ability to participate in the workforce will benefit the European countries' economies. Right, so this links back to the idea of how European countries benefited. Okay, so make sure that there's a link between your explanation and also your inference. Then this part, oh, but I can infer from source B that the European countries did not benefit from the war. Okay, So source B states that, so I can highlight this part as my details. This part that I underline in blue. What happened over here? You see that the war caused inflation, right? Because the idea of rising prices in every country, which also affects countries like Europe, okay, because of the shortage, right, of food products. Okay, so this caused a cost in the cause the cost of food to actually increase, and hence causes this inflation and increase in cost of living. Okay, so this is an example response of a cross-reference level. So if we want to move up one more level, we can think, is there a higher level to this? Can I analyze the provenance of this source? And does this source have a viewpoint or a purpose that I can use to determine whether a source is useful or not? In this case, right, if you look at the source, right, if you look at the source itself, the description, it says that it is an article published in an online journal. Okay, so actually it is not very, very rich, right, the provenance. So I can't really use purpose, so I'll use viewpoint here. If you read the whole source, you realize that we go back, right, to the previous quotation, previous analysis of source D. You realize that actually source D has quite a balanced viewpoint on this topic, right? It presents a balanced viewpoint on the impact of the war on European countries. Okay, so my assertion would be, is useful as it's reliable as it has a balanced viewpoint. So let's make my inference. So remember, a balanced viewpoint contains both sides, advantages, disadvantages, or positive effects and negative effects, for example. So in this case, you realize that source D discusses both the positive impact of the war on European countries, such as refugees boosting economic growth in these European countries, and the negative impact, such as refugees posing a financial burden to the European countries' governments. Okay, so your details are the ones that you would have quoted actually previously. Okay, the ones you see over here. Okay, the parts in blue and the parts in green for source D. And let's provide a short explanation to tie things up. So you can combine explanation. So this suggests that while European governments have to fork out money for welfare spending on these refugees, the consumption of local products by the refugees and their ability to participate in the workforce will benefit the European countries' economies. Okay, so I realized that, hey, actually, source D has a balanced viewpoint, and that's why it is reliable and therefore useful. Okay, but let's not stop here. Let's look at the provenance carefully. Okay, so we see that it's an article and it's an online journal. Okay, so an online journal is actually often written by academics. So these are experts, or basically people who have studied the issue in great detail. Okay, so I can write something like this. It's an online journal. It's published by academics, right? So these are academics, or maybe you can also write experts who have done extensive research into the topic, and because of that, they are credible. And actually, these online journals are often academic journals, and before people can actually publish these online articles, they have to go through what we call peer review. Okay, which means fellow academics or fellow experts also just have a look to basically provide their input and feedback, okay, before it can be published. And because of this, it makes source D reliable and therefore useful. Okay, so make sure that whenever you talk about viewpoint and purpose as well, make sure you provide a short explanation of the provenance or the analysis of the provenance of your AP at the end to wrap things up. So basically, how the provenance affects, right? How this person might have portrayed this particular situation. So in this case, because this person has done so much research as an expert, is able to provide this balanced viewpoint. So not just have a one-sided viewpoint of the issue, but to have read enough to consider both sides of the coin. Okay, so this is all for our utility question.